This is the left forum session on Rethinking Revolution with the book launch for Socialist Register 2017 on Rethinking Revolution, which is available at the Monthly Review book table. I'm Greg Albo, one of the co-editors of the Socialist Register, and also teach at York University in political science. This volume, Rethinking Revolution, fits into a sequence that began around 2011-2012 when I joined the Socialist Register editorial group with Leo. We mapped out a sequence of 5 volumes dealing with the economic crisis, and 2 on the crisis, on its patterns, its determination, its impact. A volume in 2013 on the question of strategy. This was followed by 2 volumes on class formation on the basis that the financial crisis was going to have a large impact on the formation of the working classes and on the capitalist classes. And it was also a part of the 50th anniversary of the Socialist Register. We mapped out across those volumes a number of critical themes about what we can refer to as the 4th great crisis of capitalism, that it would be long-standing, it would be complex in its permutations, it would push even further along the processes of permanent austerity, endless war. Neoliberalism would bend, but not necessarily break, and adapt a whole new series of modes for attempting to cope with the crisis. It would involve a transformation of institutions, classes, class strategies. And at the same time, the union movements had not yet reconstructed themselves enough to cope with much of the crisis. And similarly, we were only at the nascent beginnings of the reformation of political parties and political movements, and they were now going to be tested in a very hostile context. We thought after those that we would turn to more forward-looking series of volumes, sober but attempting to be positive on the resistances that were forming. But first we decided to take, it seemed important to take a canvas of the various forms of the politics of the right. The hard right, the alt-right, the fascist right, and that's what we did in the 2016 volume a year ago, which I think still is perhaps the best survey of the various forms of the right globally. It's not limited to North America or Europe, but there's a global canvas of the formations of the right across the globe. The question then we were stuck with is how do we shift the flow of politics in a socialist direction? 2017 is, of course, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and we thought that would allow us to open up a series of questions about looking forward, use that occasion. This is not so much a canvas of the events of 1917 in themselves, or the search for a cookbook for revolution, but for thinking about the legacies of 1917 for the politics that we're trying to make today. Some of these discussions are central because of the legacies of 1917, because even accomplishing reforms today seems impossible without a revolution. Certainly a revolution in the balance of forces that presently exist. This is a question that has been long-standing in the Socialist Register, dealing with the question of revolutionary agency and the lack of any guarantees in the making of a democratic socialism. This has been a theme of the Socialist Register from the beginning. If I might quote from the preface, we refer back to Ralph Miliband in the first volume of in 1964 in his founding essay in the Register. Ralph comments, "The most obvious lesson provided by past social experience in the countries of advanced capitalism concerns the relationship between economic crisis and socialist commitment, or rather the lack of such relationship. The repetition today of the depression of the early 30s in countries like Britain and the United States would probably have far more dramatic consequences, but is by no means certain that the consequences would necessarily flow in socialist directions." That necessarily was, or unfortunately provided an indication of the revolutionary politics that formed in the 1960s and 1970s, that they were momentous in the shifting of the balance of power for a period, but they all did not lead to fundamental socialist breakthroughs. In fact, by the 1970s, Ralph, in a series of explorations dealing with the question of moving on, a phrase from a famous essay by Ralph were part of a series of essays looking at the question of remaking political agency in an uncertain future. These included essays by Andre Gortz, Ernest Mandel, Lucio Maigret, Elmar Belfader, Ellen Wood, the 1989 volume on Revolution Today, the 2000 volume on Necessary and Unnecessary Utopias, and so on. So this was has been a constant theme of the Register. If I might, I could quote from the current preface of this volume, the way that we framed looking at 1917 to 2017. The political event of gaining state power, whether by taking parliament or in a collapse of the existing political regime, has proven time and again to be less crucial than the social revolution of building capacities for self-government and the democratization and socialization of institutional resources. The event in itself may be a dramatic rupture that opens up new political possibilities and imaginaries bursting beyond the limited horizons of capitalist market calculation. But it'll never be sufficient condition for the exploited and oppressed to build their own capacities for establishing collective rather than competitive ways of living through developing socialist democracy. There is a need in this context for the left to maintain an openness to and patience with the quite varied experiments in social alternatives to neoliberalism as they emerge in the current period. It is anything but clear where new space for projects of structural reform might open up, or more profound ruptures that might suddenly burst onto the political scene. This is the mandate that we gave the contributors to the volume to explore. There's a huge range of views on revolutionary agency, prospects, issues, regions. We have an outstanding essay by Brian Palmer and Joan Sangster that deals with the legacies of 1917 for good and ill, and the way it had a long-standing impact on the development of political movements and socialist capacities. Besides others looking at 1917 and its legacy, there's August Nimtz, Tony Zuberg on the historical legacies of 1917, Jody Dean, Fabiano Escalana, Slavo Zizek, Walter Ben Michaels, Leo Panitch, and Sam Ginden on the actuality and issues of revolutionary agency today. These also include essays by David Schwartzman, who will speak in a minute, and Andreas Malm dealing with climate change and solar communism, and regional surveys on development of different revolutionary conjunctures or non-revolutionary conjunctures by Robert Kavoris, Adolf Reed, Steve Striffler, Pierre Beaudet, who will speak in a minute, Wang Wei, Hilary Wainwright, Patrick Bound, and so forth. Some of the authors that we're fortunate to have here with us today to be able to speak with us. I'm going to begin with August Nimtz from the University. We're going to begin with August Nimtz from the University of Minnesota, well known for his very important book on Marx and Engels and their contribution to the democratic breakthrough. His essay in the current register is Marx and Engels on the Revolutionary Party. August, there you are behind me. And they want you to speak into this so they can record.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank both Greg and Leo for inviting me to be a part of the Socialist Register 2007.
You're going to have to speak loud to pitch to
17. Am I heard now?
No. This is not projecting. It's just for recording, so you have to project your voice.
Okay, good. Sure.
It's a trick they pull.
If I can begin, I hadn't planned this way, but earlier today, this morning, I was on a panel where we were discussing the Bolshevik Revolution. And I mentioned in my comments that In 1901, Lenin, in an article called Where to Begin, that in many ways served as an introduction to his pamphlet, What is to be Done. He was arguing with the economists, and the economists had argued that in moments of quiescence, there's no need to build a party. And Lenin said, I beg your pardon. He says it's exactly in moments of quiescence that we need to build a revolutionary party. Because when the proverbial shit hits the fan, it's too late. There's too much turbulence. It's difficult to do so. And so she wanted to know, and by the way, the question came from what pleased me the most, the youngest person in the room. She wanted to know, in the age of Trump, what is to be done? And so I pointed out that she wanted to know, okay, give me some examples, be more concrete. And I said 1905 was, I think, the early confirmation of what Lenin argued. Things blew up in Russia in 1905, but there was no revolutionary party. There was no party in order to direct all of that energy, all of that anger and so on. And Lenin would later say that 1905 served as a dress rehearsal for 1917. And I also pointed out we had the tragic example of Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg disagreed with Lenin on the need to build a revolutionary party. It was her claim that once things do hit the fan, you can begin building a revolutionary party. And sadly, in my opinion, her perspective was proven to be erroneous. And Lenin's perspective was, in my opinion, it was indeed correct. And the best evidence for it is what exactly was happening exactly at this moment 100 years ago. Exactly at this moment 100 years ago. You could take this week. You go back and look at 100 years ago this week in Russia. And you see Lenin, he's preparing for October. And you think about all the different currents that existed within Russia and so on. You have to explain, why is it the Bolsheviks? Why were the Bolsheviks the most effective of all the currents? And my claim is exactly because Lenin understood, unlike any of the other currents, you have to prepare. You have to prepare ahead of time. So that's the claim I'm making. That's what I was trying to explain to her. What I do in the article in Socialist Register is to try to make the case that Lenin's argument has roots in Marx and Engels. Contrary to the long-standing, certainly social democratic effort to erect a proverbial Chinese wall between Marx and Engels on one side and Lenin on the other side, my claim is that the roots of Lenin's understanding and the necessity of a revolutionary party has its roots in Marx and Engels. So that's what I tried to do in the piece, is to go back from the very beginning. I claim that once Marx and Engels conclude in the thesis on Feuerbach in 1845 about the revolutionary practice and the need to change the world, I argue that within a year they are doing exactly that. In the communist correspondence societies, I argue that's their first initial revolutionary organization. And they make very clear in a letter, I think that's been unfortunately overlooked, in 1846 to Gustav Hortgen in Germany. They lay out in a 2.5-page letter the essence of party building. And what's key in that letter is we build a party in order to be ready in time when action is needed. When action is needed. In other words, the notion of preparation, being prepared, being prepared, having a party and organization in place. And 3 years later, in the Communist Manifesto, I think that's the tone, that's the essence of the manifesto. Contrary to all kinds of claims that Marx and Engels thought that socialist revolutions are inevitable, that's bogus. What the manifesto is claiming is that the class struggle is inevitable. That's the claim of the manifesto. Once class societies come into existence millennia ago, it's the class struggle that's inevitable. What's not inevitable is the outcome of the class struggle, the winners and losers. If the outcome of the class struggle was inevitable, there would have been no need for the manifesto. The word inevitable in the original unvermeidlich appears only once in the manifesto, right at the end of part 1. It's the last word when you go back to the original. And immediately after inevitable are instructions. Instructions about how the working class should organize itself and prepare. That's what's in the manifesto. I argue that the manifesto and the context of the manifesto, we should never forget, it comes out of a political organization, the Communist League. It's the Communist League. It's a proletarian organization. Marx and Engels there are assigned by the Communist League to write a document. And never should it be forgotten is that the Communist League explained to Marx, if you don't get this written in time, measures will be taken against you. This is a disciplined proletarian organization. That's what Marx and Engels functioned with there. The Communist League, I go into some of the details, I think offers rudimentary notions of what would later be called democratic centralism. I think it's in the operations within the Communist League. I go into details about that in order to try to make the case for it. One of the things about the Communist League I think is particularly interesting is that the League, this was a proletarian organization, and they were coming together with a couple of middle-class intellectuals. And they made it clear to these intellectuals that if you're going to be with us, you have to be willing to be subject to proletarian discipline. They made that very clear. And in the rules of the organization that pre-existed even before Marx and Engels joined it were requirements. If you're going to be in the organization, you got to be willing to be active. And so when the 1848 revolutions happened and so on, the Communist League, with Marx and Engels at the leadership and so on, make it very clear that the basis for membership in the organization is activism. You got to be active. Those are in the norms. Those are organizational norms of the league. How am I doing on time? Okay. Fast forward to the organization that Marx spent the most time at, the International Workingmen's Association, the first international. Here I think we find another side, another important aspect of Marx's organizational norms, context, the importance of context. What happens when you got people who are coming from very, very different kinds of backgrounds? Unlike the correspondences, well, unlike the Communist League, people coming from very diverse political backgrounds. How do you fuse them into an organization which is politically homogeneous? And that's clearly the aim of it, to make it a politically homogeneous organization. But the question is, how do you do that? And one of the problems they had to deal with were the anarchists, led by Bakunin, who wanted to claim ideological purity. And this provoked the fight, the first major fight in the socialist movement. between the Marx Party, as it was sometimes known, and the Bakunists on the question of how do you integrate people, how do you bring people from various kinds of backgrounds. So what Marx and Engels argue for is a organizational flexibility. Organizational flexibility in order to aid and abet political homogeneity, which is a different kind of attack. It was a different context. In a communist league, you're beginning with people who are pretty much politically homogenous. When you get to First International, that's a different kind of a situation. But the aim is toward political homogeneity. And in the end, that begins to develop. But exactly because of the operations of the Bakunists within the First International, the organization basically comes to an end in 1872, 1874, when the headquarters is moved from Europe to New York. From then on, Marx and Engels are not involved directly in any kinds of political organization, but they're providing lots of advice, especially to the German party. And in the German party, they deal with this problem of, well, a number of problems, but the problem of reformism, the question of discipline within an organization. What is the relationship between the parliamentary delegation and the rank and file within the organization? In the end, despite the best efforts of Marx and Engels to try to deter the reformist direction of the German party, reformism asserts itself. It becomes hegemonic within the German party. So I pretty much end, because remember, Marx dies in 1883, Engels dies in 1895. But I think I've been able to make a convincing case that the roots of their perspective are at the roots of what Lenin would be able to do. I take up, by the way, what happens in the Soviet Union, what happens in Comintern, the 21 conditions and so on, the organizational principles about Leninist organization, party building and so on. So those are the kinds of things I could do. And the purpose of this, again, is to how to relate exactly to the young person who asks this question, what do you do now? What is to be done now?
Thank you, August. As you can see, we were very lucky to get August to write one of the essays he's become known for his close textual reading and his provocative argument defending the democratic moment in Marx and Engels against the dissenters. We now turn to David Schwartzman from Howard University. We have a couple of essays in this volume, although the question of eco-socialism spills across them. Andreas Malm has a wonderful essay on revolution in a warming world from Russia to Syria. Deals with kind of the various conditions dealing with fossil capitalism. And we have David picking up on his many articles over the years on solar communism, eco-socialism, and so forth. His essay this year is entitled Beyond Eco-Catastrophism, The Conditions for Solar Communism. David, who has a bad cold, as you'll see her in a moment.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank the editors for inviting me to be in such distinguished company. I've been reading Socialist Register for over 30 years. I never dreamed that I would be in this volume with Tatlin's Tower, right? Isn't that Tatlin's Tower? A little personal note. My father, Max Schwartzman, I'm a red diaper baby. My father, Max Schwartzman, was born 2 years before the Russian Revolution, and my mother, Miriam Kravitz, was born 2 years after 1917. They're both gone. And my dad told me that, by the way, they met in the Young Communist League in Brooklyn in 1940 about. They had about 20,000 members then. Yeah, big branch. And my dad said that I was conceived in celebration of a certain event. Let's see if you can guess what it was. I was born on Halloween 1943. What happened 9 months before? The most decisive battle in World War II. Stalingrad. Field Marshal Frederick Paulus surrendered. I verified this by looking at the New York Times on February 1st, 1943, the headline. And I was born 9 months later, so I have eternal gratitude to the Red Army. Now, the rest of my discussion will be kind of a polemic with Slavoj Žižek, who unfortunately couldn't be here to make a dirty joke about what I have to say. But here is, I found his essay addressing the impossible very useful as a contrast to what I was arguing. So the rest of them I'm going to read. And I hope I'm loud enough. In his contribution to Rethinking Revolution, Žižek wrote, addressing the impossible, his message: forget about alternatives to real existing capitalism and, by clear implication, any chance of preventing climate catastrophe. How inspiring to the millennials. In glaring contrast to Che Guevara's "Be realistic, demand the impossible," Žižek concludes his essay with this, quote, "The true courage is not to imagine an alternative, but to accept the consequences of the fact there is no clearly discernible alternative. The dream of an alternative is a sign of theoretical cowardice. It functions as a fetish which prevents us from thinking through to the end of the deadlock of our predicament. In short, the true courage is to admit that the light of the end of the tunnel is most likely the headlight of another train approaching us from the opposite direction." This passage was apparently first written in 2015 in the immediate aftermath of the surrender of the left-wing Greek government to the terms of the European bankers. Ascending from the abstract to the present conjuncture, we are on the fossil capital train, with the engineer being the military, industrial, nuclear state terror and surveillance complex. The oncoming train is climate catastrophe. True courage is a determination to derail both trains before collision, which means a commitment to organizing on an unprecedented transnational scale before the shrinking window of opportunity disappears. The light of the end of the tunnel is the sun, passively offering its power for a new global civilization, solar communism, whose path is the discernible alternative, eco-socialist transition. The so-called courage of hopelessness that Žižek invokes from Giorgio Agamben is rather the voice of a coward in retreat from any sense of profound responsibility to our children on the planet. When Žižek endorsed Trump, did he understand that Trump's climate denialism and commitment to expanding coal mining and fracking is to shrink this window of opportunity even more? While some may read Žižek's essay as a provocation, I take it as a long, tedious, cynical joke, not even close to his notorious, not politically correct repertoire. Once again, Žižek, who fiddles while the climate burns, triangulates between communism, neoliberalism, and right-wing populism instead of seeking a path to the discernible alternative he finds missing. As a start, perhaps he should consider how networking the World Social Forum process might contribute to more cohesive global movement with the capacity to first check the imperial agenda and then proceed to eco-socialist transition. Yes, Žižek has tried to keep his communist credentials intact by co-editing the idea of communism books, the Verso Press, the latest being volume 3. In that volume, he opines, quote, "The solution is to become fully aware of the explosive sets of interconnections that make the entire situation dangerous. Once we have achieved this, we should be able to embark on a long and difficult work of changing coordinates of the entire situation. Nothing less will do, nothing less than a new communist project. He wrote that in 2006. In his contribution to the edited volume, An American Utopia, Dual Power and the Universal Army, Zizek says, what today's left needs is such seeds of imagination that would enable it to not only provide a new vision of communist society, but also break out of the terrifying impoverishment of imagination in late capitalist society. But he himself is trapped in this impoverishment when in the same essay he writes, he asserts, Marx's fundamental mistake was to conclude that a higher social order, communism, is possible, an order that would not only maintain but even raise to a higher degree and effectively and fully release the potential of the self-increasing spiral of productivity which in capitalism, on account of its inherent obstacle, contradiction, is again and again thwarted by social destructive economic crises, end quote. I would submit this is not a fundamental mistake, but rather a profound insight, and this is from my own chapter. Quote, indeed, the reproduction of capital utilizing productive forces powered by fossil fuels created the material conditions leading both to this bifurcation, that is between climate hell and the other world that's possible, and its potential resolution, which we now face in the 21st century. Either the abyss of climate catastrophe driven by carbon emissions or an ever-diminishing chance of what would appear to be a miraculous escape from this abyss powered by renewable energy technologies. Of course, information technologies, the product of the self-increasing spiral of productivity, are coupled to renewable energy technologies, and communism is contingent on necessary and sufficient class struggle, not an inevitable but still possible outcome. This challenge is not mentioned in the 3 volumes of The Idea of Communism. Climate change or the environment is not even in the index. Zizek moves to his neoliberal vertex, Lacanian human nature primordial, following Jameson's lead in American Utopia. Quote, in communism, precisely insofar as it will move to a more just society, envy and resentment will explode. But Jameson's, quote, communism is a grotesque, depoliticized vision, full employment by universal conscription in a militarized economy. In her contribution to An American Utopia, Jody Dean, in contrast, gets it precisely right in critiquing Jameson's utopia. Quote, the people do not and cannot appear as a collective subject to the extent that the utopian proposals put out features of the given, arranging them so that we can see our own tendencies differently. Jameson's book is effective. It puts before us a society in which the political has been replaced by computers and therapy, and collective action has been displaced by work and leisure. For a left that refuses the political, that rejects the state, abandons the party, betrays the crowd, and mistrusts the people, this is what utopia looks like. And of course, not only read her chapter in this volume of Rethinking Revolution, but also her book, Crowds and Party. No wonder Zizek gives Jameson enthusiastic praise. Should we settle, quote, for communism of scarcity resembling the worst side of 20th century real existing socialism, given the bifurcation we face, 2 paths, either to climate hell with, at best, primitive communism for the minority of humanity who survived climate catastrophe outside the gated commons of the billionaires, or to a discernible alternative avoiding this catastrophe with virtually free energy to drive a global economy. I'm almost done. Can one imagine a more utopian scenario with the prefiguration of transnational solidarity of the global subject emerging as the only conceivable force capable of creating a communist society? In contrast to Zizek's pessimism, the other chapters in Socialist Register 2017 are highly illuminating, and I would give them credit for being provocative. In recognition of the global climate energy challenge, I especially recommend the contribution of Andreas Malm, the author of Fossil Capital, and that of Patrick Bonds. And of course, I invite critique of my own contribution, in which I unapologetically take seriously not only Che's advice, but also the inspiration of Ernst Bloch invoked in Leo Panitch's closing chapter on the revolutionary optimism of the intellect. Recall that Zizek was co-editor of, quote, The Privatization of Hope, Ernst Bloch and the Future of Utopia, 2013. How Zizek's claim that, quote, the dream of an alternative is a sign of theoretical cowardice, end quote, is consistent with the principle of hope is anyone's guess. And to reload Lenin in this conjuncture, quote, to recognize the potentiality of the moment and act, unless we lose the chance to change the future. And second, to utilize every division in the ruling class to gain the necessary political momentum to prevent catastrophic climate change. That was from my essay I wrote in 2009. Thank you. I'm done.
We intentionally did not want to have a single voice in analyzing Rethinking Revolution. David just illustrates that we have, in his critique of Slavo's essay and other things by Slavo, that we certainly don't. We will probably come back and debate some of Slavo's interpretations along with David a little bit later. We have a huge number of cases in the essay dealing with present political conjunctures and revolutionary developments. We're very proud that we have our first essay on Quebec over the 50-odd years of the Register with Pierre Beaudet from the University of Ottawa. He is a professor in development studies at the university, founder of the major Quebec organization Alternative, and editor of the leading journal of socialism in Quebec. Pierre's essay this year is titled In Search of the Modern Prince, the New Quebec Rebellion. Pierre.
Right, good afternoon. I'll come in this discussion from a slightly different angle because I want to talk about what I know best, which is what happened in this little village of ours, north of this New York City. First, I want to say that the title, Rethinking Revolution, it's a good title, but my footnote would be to be careful that the relatively traditional view of revolution is some sort of cataclysmic event, like a big rupture after and before and after, while I think all of us in the left has evolved and we see it now as a prolonged process, okay, the kind of Gramscian war of position, stop and go, that kind of stuff. I recognize our struggle more in that mold than in the major cataclysmic event like it was in the past. Okay, so that's only a footnote. We have gone through in recent times a relatively, I would say, progressive and positive advance of the left and of the popular movement. I put the two together, left and popular movements, I'll explain later. And in fact, by coincidence, this week, the leader of the student rebellion in 2012 was elected in the National Assembly with 70% of the popular vote, which was a huge victory because, well, he ran for a left-wing party, which was quite small until recently, but now is between 15% and 20%. He's 27-year-old, and he led that movement, and now he's a bit of the symbol, but more than the symbol, a rassembler of popular forces and movement. And so that's an indicator, not the end of the story, of course, but it shows that, you know, we're in a relatively good mood, contrary to here in the United States. And so, why is that? Few points. In 2012, there was a extraordinary, unpredictable alignment of the stars, all right? There was a sort of political crisis, but not too extensive. And then there was a student movement, which at the beginning was a student movement and not a popular movement. And there were other factors. You could see there was a sort of urban rumor that something was bound to happen. And it did. So over 3-4 months, we had 300,000 people in the streets. We had every night 4, 5, 6 demonstrations, and we won. It doesn't happen very often. The student movement, the student leadership, including Gabriel, who was elected earlier this week, God, they were wise. One of the things is that they created a vast coalition. He was part of the radical part of the student movement, all right? Arguing an anti-capitalist student movement, arguing for decommodation of education and an anti-capitalist approach. Well, but for this movement and for this strike, they enlarged and they got together with all the student groups, and it became a powerful force over one single demand, not two, not three, one, which was at the same time extraordinarily simple and immediate to understand, and loaded with a long-term perspective, and that was no increase in tuition fees. All right? Sounds economistic, sounds a bit banal, but it was not. And around the students, by the way, about 250,000 students, came the rest of the community organization and the people of the street, not the organized people, not the usual leftists or trade unionists, the people of the street. And that's why it created such a critical mass, which succeeded in putting the government in complete disarray, actually. And at the end of the process, there was an election, the government was defeated. So it sounds wonderful. It is, with certain blind spots and things that we have to consider. In parallel to this incredible popular mobilization, by the way, Montreal is about not even 3 million people. So when you have 300,000 people, you know, it's not a small and insignificant event. It's revealing of not only profound social fractures, but the will to fight and the sentiment that we can win, even if, okay, we are in a neoliberal capitalist countries, in fact, just like here. So in parallel to that, there was a major reorganization of the political intervention of the people's movement and of the left. The left, traditionally fragmented in different parties, competing each other. I'm the vanguard, no you, etc. I don't know what they had spoke that morning, but they said, no, this is enough. But in fact, it didn't occur within the left. It occurred within the popular movements, who became very politicized and agreed, understood, and said that all our struggles for education, defense of public sector, etc., etc., had to be politicized. And it came from within the popular movements, the trade unions, the community groups, and the wonderful women's movement that there is there, etc., etc. So it pushed, it created an atmosphere where the left, with a relatively good tradition but still very small, said, okay, can we come out of the box and create something new? Not only a new organization, but a new way to think a political process, and that led to, it's called Québec Solidaire, QS. And it was created by the head of the women's movement and with the support of almost everyone else in town on the left. Immediately, the idea was to create a rainbow coalition, all right, with different views, different approach, different political thinking, not anti-capitalist in the traditional sense, anti-neoliberal, feminist, green, internationalist, and in sync, in link with the indigenous movement, which is another story that needs to be told somewhere else. So there was a semi-spontaneous process with writers, organic intellectuals, left-wing parties that led to that process, and that's where we are now. Now, is it a model? Certainly not. It's very specific. It's related to a political culture. It's related to the national identity of the Québécois and many other factors. So just like in Spain with Podemos or in Bolivia with MAS, there's not a model that is emerging. Rather, we should speak of laboratories and experiment. What is this party? Well, I call it a non-party party. It's just a metaphor, a non-party party. A non-party party does not function seeing itself as in some sort of hierarchical order over other social and political actors. It's a part of a popular movement. It's not over and above. And it recognized that people's movement, even relatively small grassroots initiative, they think, they reflect, they analyze, they have their own organic intellectual, they produce documents. They don't need a sort of selected group of people with some sort of science because they're producing knowledge themselves. And so the non-party party acts as a parcel of a larger movement. What does it do? What is it? What is value added? It's something that is still emerging, not necessarily clear-cut. It produces toolboxes, all right? It accumulates the different experiences and put it at the service of the popular movements. It is the voice of the popular movements in the political arena. And now we have our member of parliaments. In fact, we have 3, which is an incredible achievement in the non-democratic system in Canada, just like in the United States. It was extremely difficult to squeeze in the scene. So they act as the voice of the popular movement. Constantly in consultation, they're constantly challenging their own ideas and trying to develop new perspectives so that it appears at a larger level than just locally. So that's the non-party party. And it works, I'm repeating myself, not as a substitute, not as something that, okay, without it the people will be lost. No, excuse me, the people will not be lost without it. The people will be enhanced, their organizations will move at a larger scale, yes, but it's not a substitute. And in fact, how should I say, the center of gravity of all this growth and evolution is the people's movement. It's the centrality is there with the people's movement, their capacity to struggle, to resist, to design strategies, and to win even small battles. Sometimes they're not so small because they are empowering and they're giving the idea that yes, we can confront this monster and not wait or some sort of long-term event. So to conclude, there are many, many obstacles and many challenges, one of which is that we're in North America. We're, 70 kilometers from this country with all the power forces that don't need to agree. So our margin of maneuver, it's not like if we were in Uruguay. But we have to face that situation, and we still can continue this organization and the spirit of resistance. A challenge that I think it's particularly important to me is to continuously develop the critical thinking. We have not inherited some sort of treasure that we need to turn on and off, call it Marx, or call it Rosa Luxemburg, or call it Gramsci, extraordinary thinking. It's not over. It's perhaps the beginning of creating a critical knowledge and, in fact, decolonizing knowledge. Because our knowledge, Eurocentric, male-dominated, etc., even on the left, needs to be deconstructed and reconstructed. It's going to take some time. And the women, and the young people, and the indigenous will take the leadership of reinventing a critical knowledge that will be able to propose new methodologies and new approaches and new strategies to confront the system and to win. The word winning, it's a bit new in our vocabulary because we've been defeated so many times. We're small people. We've been beaten in the head. We had the army in the streets of Montreal not so long ago. So we sort of internalized, the idea that this monster capitalism was, come on, we're never going to be able to challenge it. Now, I think this is an idea that we have to go after. And in a realistic approach, it's not, if we think of winning, it's not meaning that we can win everything. We can win a battle, we can defeat a government, we can elect some of our friends, of our comrades, but the idea of progressing through and beyond our struggles is very important. 1 minute. This process is full of risk. There's no blueprint. We're not starting with, this is plan 1, 2, 3. So it's demanding. And I will end on the global context. No way this incredible battle, I think I should say it like that, in North America, it's relatively unique. It cannot go on its own. We are a village and we're not a village. We're in the ocean, and so therefore struggling with our friends in Canada, excuse me for saying, but it's not the same country, and in the United States it's absolutely necessary. During the student movement, you might remember that we were wearing a red square. Half of the city of Montreal were wearing a red square. It broke our heart when we saw the students here at Union, what's the university? Cooper Union, wearing this. So it was the beginning of a sort of solidarity tradition that it's important to nurture and to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Some of my former Quebec law students gave me these amazing ceramic sculpted squares that I have on my desk in my office and on my kitchen table and so on. We turn now to Leo Panitch, the co-editor of the Socialist Register, also former professor, recently retired from the political science department at York University. He wrote his essay in this year's volume with Sam Gindin, titled Class Party and the Challenge of State Transformation. Leo.
Thanks, Greg. Most of the pieces in this year's volume address the current conjuncture. David Schwartzman's is very visionary on the necessity and possibility of solar communism. August looks back at the inspiration you can draw from Marx as to the possibility of a democratic socialism. But most of the pieces are attempting to address what does revolution mean in the current conjuncture of a global capitalism, where virtually every facet of the lives of people around the world are captured within capitalist social relations and commodification. And there are, Sam and I argue in our essay, 4 elements to this current conjuncture that we have to rethink revolution within. The first is the delegitimation of global neoliberalism. Not so much its ideology was never that popular. When Perry Anderson said in 2000 that neoliberalism was the most successful ideology in world history, even then that had to be taken with a grain of salt. People need to remember the opposition to free trade in this country. NAFTA was hardest to get through in the United States than in Canada or Mexico. And that opposition came very largely from the unions and the working class communities, some of whom are now voting against NAFTA, but without a voice for it in the choices available to them apart from Sanders in this election, ended up voting for the xenophobic scoundrel who is now your president. So it wasn't so much that neoliberal ideology was ever so popular, not to speak of it, of course, in other parts of the world, not to speak of it in relation to Seattle and the anti-globalization movement, etc. No, it's rather that the institutions that brought us neoliberalism are actually being delegitimated. The European Union, astonishingly. The parties of the center-right, including in many ways the Republican Party, who are losing their traditional base and throwing up a new one, which is uncomfortable to the ruling classes themselves. Uncomfortable because what is being articulated by the new far right, as opposed to the center right, is an ideology against global neoliberalism. It may not be able to stand up to the forces that are continuing to generate global and capitalist globalization, but it articulates a nationalism that is contradictory to it, and may lead to the inability of even the American state to reproduce neoliberalism, to contain its crises. A second facet of the current conjuncture, and this relates to the first, is the particular delegitimation of social democracy. The delegitimation of that wing of the historic labor movement, the political wing of the historic labor movement, and in the United States, that wing of it, which was never in any sense socialist, but was aligned with the trade union movement since the New Deal. That is being delegitimated by virtue of its embrace of global neoliberalism, as represented by the Clintons, who indeed were a model for the Third Way and the Blairites in Europe, who were emulating the Clinton-led Democratic Party as they embraced global neoliberalism. And we may be seeing, as we see the inability of those social democratic parties, those center-left parties, not only here in the United States, to retain their working class base to such an extent that they can get reelected. We're seeing that around the world. It was represented, first of all, of course, by the total collapse of PASOK in Greece, But we see it now in France with the Socialist Party securing less than 10% of the vote in the last election. And we've seen it with the travails of the Labour Party until there was this successful insurgency within it. The third aspect of the crisis, and this is very, very sobering, and it follows from the second very directly, is that working class communities, significant portions of them at least, which were bastions of trade union strength through the course of the 20th century, which voted for the left through the course of the 20th century, are now open to the appeal of the xenophobic right. Insofar as that xenophobic right articulates an anti-neoliberal globalization appeal, and speaks directly to the working class, as Trump did. And this is very troubling, very, very dangerous. It was seen in Brexit. It's seen in the appeal that Le Pen has to large pockets of ex-communist support. The fourth aspect of the current conjuncture, much more hopeful, exactly what Pierre was speaking to, has been a shift on the left, a very marked one, from protest to politics. The protest against neoliberal globalization, which went on from the Indian peasants opposing free trade in 1995 to Seattle to the anti-globalization movement, reaching its culmination with Occupy, with the indignados in Spain, etc. Since 2011, 2012, has taken a distinctly political turn. It was seen in the emergence of new parties, the success of Syriza as the only place since the eruption of the global capitalist crisis in 2008 where a left party was actually elected, but also seen with the rise of Podemos, etc. And it's seen in the insurgencies in the Labour Party with Corbyn and the Sanders insurgency with the Democratic Party. In this context, we need to ask ourselves whether we are moving from the sublime to the ridiculous when we talk about rethinking revolution in this context. From, if you like, tragedy to farce. In the centenary of the Russian Revolution, in what sense do Syriza or Podemos or Corbyn or Sanders really represent revolutionary possibilities or forces? We need to take a deep breath and ask ourselves that question. As is patently obvious with Syriza, the excitement that their election generated has been followed by a terrible wave of disappointment, not surprisingly, as they were unable to escape the strangulation of the European Union. What does it mean that Sanders and his movement is called Our Revolution, insofar as it is taking place within the Democratic Party? And yet, Pierre, precisely as Pierre, I think, was articulating so well, what Syriza represented, what Podemos represented, what Sanders represents and Corbyn represents, is a remarkable resurgence of transformative hope and indeed a great deal of hard political effort to discover new ways of doing politics. And in that sense, I think we're seeing, and the article argues that we're seeing, in this second decade of the 21st century, the emergence, partly because of the collapse of social democracy, partly because of its loss of its working class base, the possibility in the 20th century of building revolutionary capacity. We need to begin by understanding that we're hardly there. that the wonderful phenomenon of Syriza getting elected was bound to produce disappointment in the short run. Had Sanders become president, it was never very credible when he answered in response to questions, what would you do as president? He said, well, there would be a mass movement behind me. That really have been enough? Been sitting in the Oval Office alone in the face of the kind of Democratic Congress he would have had around him and a Republican majority in it, probably? Were Jeremy Corbyn to win this election, imagine the position he would be in with a majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which remains Blairite, and a party apparatus which is largely made up of people, those who are full-time staff, whose main expertise is that of expelling people who were seen as too radical from the Labour Party. They've been doing that since the 1950s. Corbyn is trying to change this, but hardly has made a dent in it. So we're only at the beginning. That is not in any sense to devalue what Corbyn and Sanders represent inside these insurgencies. And I wouldn't even want to be dismissive, and the article is not dismissive, of Syriza in Greece. On the contrary, it tries to think through its dilemma. And I'll just end with this. Its fundamental dilemma, was that it was able to make a breakthrough electorate, but in order to try to think about how it could possibly govern the existing, corrupt, freak state, it put most of its emphasis on where do we find the honest, capable people that we can take with us into government. Some of them from Syriza, some of the best cadres in Syriza, some of them from outside. What it didn't think very much about was what do we do when we lose those cadres in terms of organizing outside the state, in terms of building support for us outside the state. You know, if you read the Syriza party program, just before it was elected, it ends with, we don't see the party as a slingshot which shoots the leadership of Syriza into the state and leaves it there and expects it to be able to do it by itself. We see ourselves as part of a catalytic, multi-dimensionary, subversive movement. And only in that way will a Syriza government, with that movement behind it, pressuring it, be able to do anything inside the state. Well, once they got inside the state, neither the movement took the responsibility to say this is how the Ministry of Education needs to be changed in order to facilitate what we're doing in the solidarity networks, nor did those inside the state take responsibility for trying to develop the capacities of those outside the state to democratize the Ministry of Education. But more than that, and I think we have to think this through very seriously, Pierre was alluding to it when he talked about the little village north of the United States. And this has always been the question of the Russian Revolution, which is raised to us again today, visibly by Syriza, but it would be true in almost every country, maybe even inside the American empire itself. Can we make a breakthrough in terms of attempting to transform any given state, insofar as there is not a fundamental shift in the balance of forces in other states? What made it impossible for Syriza to do what it wanted to do was that the change in Syriza, just like the change in Russia in 1917, did not lead to a sufficient change in the balance of forces in Germany. That was the fundamental problem. And unless space had been open for a Syriza government, by virtue of a shift in the balance of forces in Europe, not least inside the labor movements of Northern Europe, which didn't raise a finger for Syriza, indeed had to face the equivalent of what blacks in this country would call racism from the German working class. Those who live in the southern periphery of Europe are lazy. They don't work hard enough. They want to live off the handouts of the state. That's the attitude. And the inability of socialist movements, of labor movements, of trade union movements elsewhere to shift those attitudes was the fundamental limitation that Syriza faced. So when we look at these examples, rather than get disappointed by how much they're able to achieve, we rather need to look to ourselves in terms of our ability to transform attitudes in our own country with regard to providing space for the socialist alternatives that are being seeded as we speak. Thank you.
So you can see from the presentations that we have a wide range of contributions taking on the obstacles which can't be moved on, and the need for new seeds through where we have new openings to the issues demanding attention. We have about a half hour, so we'll take a range of interventions and contributions. And we'll try to balance it with coming back to the panel as necessary. Yes.
My name
Could
is
you actually, I guess I'm going to try.
I am. I do work in Cuba Solidarity, solidarity with an actual real revolution that still exists. And, I was listening especially to the last very stimulating discussion. It reminded me of Malcolm X, one of my favorite quotes from him about a chicken cannot produce a duck egg. I'm not so sure that I see the collapse of social democracy as much as a sort of a revival of it in a more outwardly left-wing, especially relatively speaking, context. Of all these things you cited, Syriza, Podemos, Bernie Sanders phenomenon, although that was within the Democratic Party, not a traditionally social Democratic Party. And then the Corbyn victory in the Labour Party and twice in leadership elections, the upsurge of young people joining in and so on and so forth. That I think that there's this attempt to use as a vehicle by a new generation and other people that are fighting to try to come up with some vehicle to promote their demands. And so I think it's led to these mass movements, and any real revolution, if you want to use revolution in classic Marxist sense, has to be the background of it has to be a germinating and rising mass movements, and then different tendencies politically respond to that. So I think that's something that's developing, and it's bound to be disappointing because a chicken cannot produce a duck egg. So once these forces get in, they come up against all the things, the nature of the state, the forces against it, and all of these things. But at the same time, we know this is not the first period of neoliberal globalization, like the pre-World War I period, although that was a colonial era too. But these mass struggles, the election of some of these things will lead to big new openings for even more struggle.
Can we have your first name, just so the panelists can get back to you easier?
Oh, my name is Ike.
Yep, that's all. Can we have your first name, just so the panelists can go back to you?
My name is Geraint.
Speak loudly.
Speak louder so we can hear you back here.
Sorry.
To the
My name
back.
is Geraint, I really enjoyed this panel, and it was sort of one of the things that was interesting is this morning I was at a panel on, I think, 150 years after Capital, And so now we've got 150 years after capital and then 100 years after the 1917 revolution. And one of the things that this panel made me think about is the relationship between these two, especially with respect to thinking about alternative, as I think David Schwartzman was talking about in response to Zizek. There's a sense of, there's a sense that, okay, there is no alternative. There's that almost the Tina keeps coming back, right? And I think one of the things I'd like to hear the panelists say a little more about is what the alternative looks like in relationship to something like Marx's analysis of capital. Because I think what really I think distinguishes the Marxist project is the notion of the alternative or revolution is not just something in the abstract, but it represents the determinate negation of capitalism in some way, right? So that there's a way in which that's got to be much more concrete. Otherwise, it looks like you can see why the pessimism in the air will sort of start beginning to make Zizek look like, oh, he's making a lot of sense, because it looks like the difference between, you know, after 1917 and then after like the 70s, 80s, and especially after the Cold War, is the alternative that appeared to be actually existing seems to have been taken away from us, and then the other ways in which the other sorts of possibilities seem to be being crushed as well. So I think I'll stop there.
Others?
So, let's just ask about Pierre's footnote before we started, which was, I think revolution could be slow and gradual instead of punctual and a rupture in time. And I wonder how much you think about that and what counts as transformation. And how much thinks about city. I feel like a lot of times here at Left Forum, we're quickly dismissive of any half-ass changes, like the healthcare that we got under Obama and that we might lose now. But I think there's a big change. And I wonder if the left generally doesn't think so. That's interesting. They think it is. It might sort of change our sense of what this conjuncture is about and what our alliances and legals are about. So I'd just like to hear a little reflection on what kinds of transformation counts.
Others? Yes, sir? And your name first, name?
My name is Robert Wright. This is for Professor Nimtz. In the context that you discussed Marx and Engels' discussions with individuals on preparation, the need to be prepared for what will come down, where do you think things stand right now, particularly in this country, structurally, ideologically, in terms of dealing with the masses and their attitude toward this preparation? Because I think there's a tendency sometimes in the left to have this organizational or independent focus on what they think preparation is, as opposed to, and I'm just wondering where you see things at now.
Good. That's a tough question for you. Others? Yes, sister there?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Mariah Clegg, and I'm from the UCSB working with Kevin Anderson from the International Marxist Unionist Organization. And I'm about to start a project on energy democracy in Santa Barbara, so this is particularly to you, David Schwartzman. And I have some hang-ups about solar communism. I'd really like to know more about your thoughts on it. And in particular, I'm wondering what is it in particular to solar energy that is particularly suited to communism? Is it kind of the democratic potential? Is it the decentralized potential? Is it that it's simply that it's renewable? Because certainly there are issues of, where do we get minerals, all those kinds of questions. And if solar is not inherently communistic, how do we make it communistic?
Okay, I'll take one. Jess?
It's for Pierre about Quebec. I'm curious as to what the program was that the comrade ran on to get elected into the Quebec Parliament, and the difficulties that Quebec Solidaire, I don't recall how many members there are in the provincial parliament, but how does one implement a program like that and work with the external having gone through Syriza and Greece, which was very disappointing when they had a much larger possibilities, but we're talking about an alternative to our preconceived notions of revolution and major change. I worry about once in politics in that sense, then the organization becomes something just to elect people, and they get paid a lot of money when they're in power, and it becomes somewhat difficult, I think. I'm just curious as to how you think you're going to handle that.
Okay, is there anyone else? Because I think if I turn to the panel, it'll take up much of our rest time. So. Yep.
Yeah, so building on that question, you mentioned that it's a non-party party.
Adam, sorry.
Adam. You mentioned it's a non-party party, and I like that, but building on that question, that's a slogan, which I'm sure you're well aware. It's a damn good one. But nonetheless, it is a slogan. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about more concrete ways that you're thinking through in terms of trying to stave off the kind of like material relations that get embedded in individuals and collectivities and the demands and your organizations and so on.
Perfect. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to turn back to the panel in the order they presented in to allow us to give them enough time to respond. So, August? Maybe they probably want you to speak into the
I think, at least for me, I think history is extremely important as a place to begin, for thinking these questions. And my brief answer to your question is that, yeah, that we don't have a party in place. It doesn't exist. That's the reality that we face. And we have to think about that. I'm convinced, unless others know better, there will be social explosions, big social explosions in the future. That we don't have to have any doubts about. If anybody does, we can discuss it. There will be big social explosions. The problem is there a leadership in place to channel that energy and anger to actually make a revolution? That requires organization. We don't have that. We have to admit it. Are there any lessons from history? I think 1905 in Russia was an example of what happens when you didn't have a party in place. There's a social explosion that takes place. Lenin's insight in 1901 is not an insight that could actually be fulfilled in time for 1905. Lenin would say oftentimes that 1905 was the dress rehearsal for 1917. In between 1905 and 1917, Lenin went about the process of party building. And one of the ways in which he did that was to use the electoral and parliamentary process. It's something that most of the left ignores. His opponents and enemies, of course, we know why. But most of the left ignores Lenin's activities between 1906 and 1917. He's making use of the electoral parliamentary process to build the Bolsheviks. Where he differs from the Social Democrats, and he's very clear about that, is to use the electoral parliamentary process not as an end in themselves, but as a way to get our ideas in order to be able to count their forces, to be able to determine when the time to launch the armed struggle. You use the electoral process to figure out when are you strong enough to launch the armed struggle. And that goes back to Marx and Engels. It goes back to, I argue, to the 1850 address in March of 1850. That's exactly the perspective that Marx and Engels put forward. And so what Lenin is arguing for is what he calls later revolutionary parliamentarism. He's trying to differentiate himself from the Social Democrats. Social democracy is into electoral and parliamentary processes and end in themselves. What they would call parliamentary cretinism. I coined a new term. I think it's original. It's called voting fetishism. And what I mean by voting fetishism is the assumption that when you vote, you're actually exercising power. No. When you vote, all you're doing is registering a preference. Power has to be taken. Power has to be taken. And that's what the Bolsheviks, that's what Lenin understood. So yes, we don't have that in place. And we may have to go through a 1905. That's what we may have to go through in order for that to happen.
Thank you, August. Turn it over to David and hustle the mic down. Thank you.
Thank you for very good questions. First of all, I didn't really define what solar communism was. That is in the chapter, but in capsule, it's a reconceptualization of communism for the 21st century. So, from each according to her ability, to each according to her needs, applies both to humans and nature. That is the lesson of the impact of capitalism both on humans and nature. And it also connects to the point that our conception of what is the material concrete conditions for the alternative. And we cannot derive that merely from political economy. So we need to respect and utilize the scientists of thermodynamics, which point to solar energy being the only energy source where the entropy production would occur anyway. And that's discussed in the paper, because 1 hour of solar energy to the Earth equals the whole energy consumption of the civilization in 1 year. So thermodynamics, biogeochemistry, which I'm a biogeochemist, that's how I came to this from that point of view. The sciences of agroecology, and absolutely the wisdom of indigenous cultures around the world which have mastered a sustainable relation to nature in agriculture and in other ways. And all of this has to be an input to the concrete alternative. And the concrete alternative is being made now, right under capitalism. It's made now. The prefiguration of the future are being created now. And when these prefigurations are social and material, and most of all solidarity, is the prefiguration of the global subject that has to emerge to have any chance of avoiding the worst forms of climate catastrophe. This global subject, and I love what Pierre had to say about the non-party party, because we have to think very hard about how that global subject emerges. And there's going to be a panel tomorrow where I'm going to talk about the prefiguration of the global subject. So that's Albo is the organizer, who's an old collaborator of mine, who's from NYU. And we collaborated on biogeochemistry, but I've gotten him into the left forum. I'm very proud of that fact. And so that's my attempt to address your very important points. Again, solar energy, and final points, the emphasis on decentralized, community-owned, community-managed is a prefiguration of what the alternative will be. And finally, these prefigurations have to be also coordinated with the political movement that enables the eco-socialist transition to take place. And I put a lot of emphasis on what is the big obstacle to having any success avoiding climate catastrophe, I say the military-industrial with all the adjectives. That's the obstacle, not because its emissions are so huge. It's actually about 1% of the global, but rather it is the obstacle because it prevents the cooperation that's necessary all over the world to between different countries, and of course it's an obstacle because of $2 trillion a year in the military expenditures. Okay, that I get into more on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Pierre.
Pierre now.
Okay, briefly, your question back there. I think the Second International and the Third
You
International
have to speak up a little bit.
left us with a distorted legacy, all right? Where on the one hand you had the cataclysm that was going to come someday and we would prepare, all right? And on the other hand, this endless accumulation of forces that inevitably, that was the word, inevitably would end capitalism and open the door for an anti-capitalist society. Well, both, I think, were exhausted and are now exhausted. So it's not an answer, it's rather a question. And then I think about the expression of Lenin, who said, when those from above cannot rule because they are, excuse me, fucked up. And
That's
those
French.
from below don't want.
Flemish.
So when there's this match, then big changes. So it's not linear and it's not really predictable. That's what I think. Now, the question about program and struggle. I'll give you a very concrete example. All right? Canadian capitalism is moving fast forward to become the sort of energy capital of the world. And it's not only about the tar sands, which are there stuck in the Alberta lands, but it's about pipelines, because you need to export them. And so we are full of pipeline projects. In Quebec, at this point, there's 242 local committees waiting for the pipeline to come. Come on, come on, come on, come on. They're eager because it will cut them out. And so my fear is that they're not going to come because they know it's going to be a very difficult place. Now, this is a grassroots struggle and a red-green kind of local organizing. And it's great. Now, Quebec Solidaire, what does it do with that? Well, of course, it supports it. Come on, you just support it. But then, you bring the issue of what is the alternative. The alternative in Quebec is electrification of transport under public service. And that has become a very popular idea. It's feasible, technically, financially, and otherwise. And I think we'll be able to put the ruling groups on the defensive on that. So you join the struggle with a concrete, feasible, and I think a proposal, a program that has deep implication over capitalism. Thirdly, the non-party party. There's no organizational recipe. It's not technical, it's political, it's the will of the mass organization. It's the capacity to these mass organizations to produce constantly new leadership. And so I think that's the base. But once that is said, we can be a bit clever, all right? And so what we learned, especially from Bolivia and from Spain, and that we've adapted to our situation, is that, excuse me, democratic secularism, dépassé. Comment on dit ça en anglais?
It's okay.
It's dépassé. And it's not because, well, you know, maybe it has its place in the past. But it's not the central committee that can design a policy with all the complexities. It's a series of assemblies, decentralized assemblies, with lots of debates. Yes, it takes a bit more time, this horizontalism, but it creates a deep, entrenched, okay, posturing over political issues. So it's a partial answer, not a total one. And then you have various techniques like assuring equality in the participation in the decision-making process, not just mailman, and so it's affirmative action across the board. No leaders, spokesperson that can be put on the side. The elected officials, well, thanks God we're not going to be elected in the government for the next 10 years. Yes, in 10 years we will be elected, but not so fast, in the sense that we still need to continue this entrenchment of the popular movement. And for the rest, wish us luck.
Two quick things just to follow up on Pierre. An illustrative example, on the other side of the Quebec border, in Ontario, we probably have 100 committees on organizing against pipeline. The difficulty is without Quebec, something like Quebec Solidaire, there is not kind of any meeting point for any of them, so they largely meet maybe through 350.org. But then they never think or go beyond kind of the market ecology that is embedded in 350.org. The other thing, in English, if you want to find articles on Quebec Solidaire, there's not really a good source out of Quebec. It's the Socialist Project website, the Bullet, which regularly covers as much as possible the important developments in Quebec Solidaire. Leo.
Okay, I appreciate very much the question on is this a revival of social democracy or the collapse of it? I think we have to be clear what we're talking about. For the last, at least since 1950, the parties known as social democratic parties, the parties that belong to the Second International, very clearly rejected a transition to socialism, like the Democratic Party. And indeed, for most of the European parties, the Democratic Party was their model. These were parties which explicitly were oriented to achieving a more humane capitalism. To some extent, naively, a crisis-free capitalism. It wasn't only a matter of not promulgating socialism. It was also a matter of being embarrassed by and really opposed to non-electoral social movements. These were seen as problematic, unruly from the time of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Discomforting. And always suspicious, not only suspicious that communists might infiltrate social democratic parties, but suspicious that radical movement-oriented people might. So much of what these parties did was expel such people. That's entirely apart from the question of how they behaved once they were inside the state. Whether they were engaged in trying to change the state apparatus from being reoriented to reproducing capitalist social relations, even if it was better wages, a social wage, etc., right? Or not.